Hello there, my friends. Welcome back to History for Thinkers, a show that brings history to life and makes it easy to understand. In this episode, we are going to be continuing the infamous, the nasty, the terrible Kampf analysis series. Now, before we get into the show, I want to give a massive thank you to everybody over on Patreon for supporting the show and making everything possible. Thank you guys so much. It really means the world to me that you guys care about history as much as I do. Now, I want to give a massive personal thank you to Matthew Y. Zurich for being the first and currently the only financer over on Patreon, which is the top tier. So in addition to getting bonus content, extra episodes, things like that, Matthew also gets his name on the big screen. If you're interested in joining Matthew and becoming a financer, you can get more information over on the Patreon page. A link will be in the description. And with that out of the way, let's get into the episode. Something that has always fascinated me is how different political factions fight for the true version of history. They try to make their arguments and they'll nitpick things that fit their agenda, and they'll only show you part of the story. They won't show you the whole story. You know, I understand why that style is effective. Like, I get it. You know, people want to have history according to, the left-wingers, or history according to the conservatives, or what have you, right? So this is one of the big things that you do when you're trying to get a political movement off the ground. I've been particularly interested because I've got two different American history books. And one of them is very left-wing and one of them is very right-wing. And I kind of got them both just in the hopes of seeing the complete divide, right? I mean, how you can read these two books and it's like, it's almost not even the same stuff they're talking about. I mean, it's just wild. But that's for maybe a future project somewhere down the road. But here, Hitler is actually at work doing this historical revisionism, where he's talking about how the Second Reich was really coming about, how it was, this great, wonderful thing for the Germans. People were wealthier, right? Because the problem with the German Confederation was that they were individual states. They had their individual laws and tariffs and taxes. So what ended up happening was economic trade was just a pain in the butt to do. It was just a complete nightmare, and no one wanted to do it. If you were living in one of these German states, let's say you wanted to trade with the one next to you, right? You're in Bavaria. I think one next to Bavaria is Saxony. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm sorry. But let's say you want to do one of those trades, you would have a really hard time doing so because you would have to pay tariffs and taxes in both states, and it was just a nightmare, right? We're all angry perpetually with governments and their taxes and their nonsense. And one of the things you gain when you unite a whole bunch of smaller, weaker states is that you have a better ability to trade, right? Everyone's living under the same handful of laws. Those laws apply universally, and that just makes life easier. So he kind of talks about how all these good things were happening for the German people, but he says that the cause for collapse of the Second Reich, right, Bismarck's Reich, he basically says that the symptoms, right, of course, it's always a disease with Hitler, right? Germany's going to fall, it's because of a disease. And some of these symptoms are not necessarily economic. He doesn't really think it's about money or any of that. He thinks that, it really boils down to three things: politics, morality, and race. And this is where we get to the point where Hitler is going to try to make the argument that the reason the German Empire, the Second Reich, collapsed was because it wasn't hyper-focused on race. Despite being by most standards, a very racially homogenous society. There was very little outside influence. Everyone in the second, come on, guys. This is 100 years ago in Central Europe. If you are complaining about not enough racial purity there at that time, at that place, I mean, there's something wrong with you. And that was definitely the case with the Nazis, because he's going to go on to say, all these problems all go back to, we don't care enough about race. We aren't fighting enough wars and taking enough stuff from other people. And we have, cultural subversion going on. Of course, all of that goes back to the Jews, right? So, it's just nice to see a little bit of historical revisionism, right? Because again, Mein Kampf is just this crazy book that, it's politics, it's history, it's, it's an autobiography, it's everything. It's everything and nothing in one. And then we have a little bit of an insight into what a narcissist Hitler already was by this point. Because remember, he's writing this book in prison after he tried to overthrow the government in Munich. And he says, quote, "But the fact that intelligent sections of the community regard the German collapse primarily as an economic catastrophe and consequently think that a cure for it may be found in an economic solution seems to me to be the reason why hitherto no improvement has been brought about." So, what he's saying right here is that the intelligent sections of society, in our community, in our country, they're wrong. And then, of course, he's going to go on and make his argument, just like we were saying, how he's going to tie it to race and culture and politics and, all that other stuff. But right here, you just have such a good understanding of how much he thought of himself, right? This guy is listen, all the smart people, all the intelligentsia of our society, they're all saying this one thing. It's obviously not that. Obviously. I know the answer. The guy that didn't qualify to go to architecture school. The guy that was homeless just a couple years ago. I have the answer, man. It was in those years of rigid self-education, and that was one of the problems with the Nazis generally. There were all these self-educated people, which really meant that they were just, consuming propaganda that they thought made them educated, but it didn't. So, yeah, that's just one of those really crazy parts. So here we have come to an interesting little bit, because he stops talking about the long-term inevitable symptoms of the collapse of the Second Reich. He's kind of off that, and he's talking about the presently bad situation. So at the time, this is the mid 1920s Germany. Everyone's poor, hyperinflation. People are literally starving in the streets. Suicide is up. Unemployment is up. Everything is, it's just going horribly. And he talks about how most people see the situation. And he says that most people are wrong because they think that the present misfortune that they're all going through is the result of a lost war. And he's going to try to downplay the war. He says some things, later on where he's like, listen, people lose wars all the time and it doesn't destroy their entire society. Which, at face value, that is true. Yes, people can lose wars and still have a functioning society, a functioning economy. But the problem that he kind of misses out on is, number one, this is a world war. Up to that point in history, there had never been a war so big that cost so many lives, and Germany paid the bulk of that price in lives. They lost more people, more young men than anyone else. And that right there is going to screw your whole economy up. You take a whole bunch of young working age men out of the workforce by the millions, and you can bet that's going to have some long-term consequences that are not so good for everyone. But the other point that he makes is, it's really because of the politicians that stabbed us all in the back, right? And of course he goes back to the whole, the November criminals, the people that were heading the revolution, that wanted to actually have a say in the government that, controlled them. Crazy stuff, I know. And it's really because of these revolutionaries. Now, the German government did something really, really stupid during World War I. Now, to understand what it was that they did, I want to kind of make an analogy. So I want you to imagine someone who is a boxer, someone that likes to fight. Now this guy, he's pretty buff. He's ripped. He works out all the time. He actually knows how to fight really well. He's good at it. But what he does is he starts betting on himself. So he runs up a whole credit card expense. He runs 10 grand, gets 10 grand out in cash from his credit card, and then he uses it to bet on himself that he's going to win this next fight. So he goes into the fight. He does a really good job at the start, but he loses. He loses in the end because you just don't know. Sometimes you have an off day. Sometimes outside circumstances, they just impact you in ways that you can't anticipate. And now the blow up risk is that he loses that 10 grand. He's now 10 grand in the shitter. 10 grand in the shitter. He has no idea how he's going to pay for it. And he got beat up too, so in addition to being in massive debt, he got beat up. He's probably going to be in the hospital, and that's going to be even more money, especially if he's in America, right? He's going to be paying a lot more than 10 grand in debt for the hospital trip. But you just have to imagine crazy, reckless behavior like that. That is what the German government was doing with World War I. And this is something that the Nazis and a lot of other people actually don't pay enough attention to. They were betting hard that they were going to win the war, and they didn't. Right? We got an article over here talking about this a little bit. We're not going to go through the whole thing, but there is generally this one point here that by the end of 1916, the German government was spending significantly more than it was taking in, either through its long-term loans or through taxation. So this is still accounting for the fact that you need to spend a lot of money to fight a war, right? Wars are very expensive. Governments have to spend just, boatloads of money. Boatloads of money to make a war happen. You got to pay the soldiers and all the equipment, and then, there's just so many things. And it really is like a boxer who started betting a lot of money on himself. Now, it is understandable if you have the money, if it's cash in hand. If you have the money, you're doing well for yourself before the fight, by all means, bet on yourself. But if you need to go out and you need to get a credit card and you need to get debt, and you need to take out a loan, and you're going to use that to bet on yourself, that is just crazy, reckless, and risky behavior. Because the scenario, even if you have good odds of, things working out for you, there's still that potential blow up risk. Worst case scenarios. No one likes to go through them, but at the end of the day, you have to be prepared for them. Because worst case scenarios do happen. And in the case of Germany, it was pretty bad. It was pretty bad. They even mentioned down here that the federal government's short-term floating debt eventually grew to over 30% of the federal government's total debt. That is just crazy, man. And the only way they were even going to be able to pay for this stuff was by printing all this money. And of course, we all know what inflation does to people like us. It means you have to pay $100 for a loaf of bread. You need to work a week just to be able to pay, for like something that's like relatively small, right? You got to work a whole, last week you worked all week nonstop. It was a 100-hour work week. And this week, the currency has inflated so much that all your work, all your labor goes for like one book. You can buy one book with all the money that you got from that one entire week of work. And that is very disheartening. But the other problem is that the government, when it doesn't have a way to pay for it, it prints all this money. And that was really the only way they could have paid this debt. That's just how bad it was. So that is always something that you need to kind of keep in the back of your mind when it comes to, governments spending money and making these crazy decisions. And again, I think this kind of goes back to the whole people like controlling their own government. They like to have a vote. They like to have a say. Because at least if things don't work out, you can at least sit back and be like, well, I played some part in this. I voted for this guy. He screwed up the country. At least it's kind of on me, right? Whereas the people in Germany at this time, they're now suffering hyperinflation. They're getting completely screwed, right? They had to fight a war that they didn't want, because generally most people don't want war. And, they're just suffering because of a government that they didn't have any say in, a government that controls them, that rules their lives, passes all these laws, makes all these decisions that screws them over, that they had no say in. So, at the end of the day, I think it's better to live in a crappy democracy than the best dictatorship. Because even the best dictatorship, man, there are going to be bad times, and well, you can look at the dictator and be like, listen, man, you suck. What were you thinking? You took on crazy amounts of debt that was going to screw us if we lost the war, and now we're screwed. At least when you have a say, it is partly your own doing. So that's my 2 cents on it. And here we've come to one of the scarier bits in Mein Kampf, because he's talking about, he just kind of goes on how, the Marxists and the Jews, they were blaming Ludendorff and the German military, and they were failures. And, of course, they were all lying. And then, it goes from their lying to Jews are liars. And then he quotes Schopenhauer, one of the famous philosophers, one of the big guys. And I don't think this is a real quote. Hitler is saying that Schopenhauer called the Jews the great master of lies. I looked it up online, guys. I didn't see anything that Schopenhauer had written that resembled anti-Semitism like this. I really hope he was not an anti-Semite, but he may have been. Unfortunately, even philosophers are sometimes a little loopy. But so he goes to that, and then he starts talking about disease. And I think when you start writing or talking, and you go from these people are bad, and then you start talking about disease, you inherently kind of make a certain connection. Because, well, what do you do with disease? What do you do with a disease? You try to eradicate it. And this really hits on this whole crazy, rampant anti-Semitism that was inside of this party. I mean, when you really sit back and think about the problems that go on inside of a country, you realize that they are very complex. It's very difficult to claim to have some kind of answer. I mean, anyone that personally, I think is worthy of respect is someone that, even if they have strong opinions, they can acknowledge when, maybe they just don't know everything about this topic. Or, hey, I don't know or care about this topic, right? I mean, I remember I used to listen to political commentaries all the time. And I remember this one guy kept getting asked by people, hey, talk about global warming, talk about, climate change. And the guy was like, I don't know anything about it, and I don't care to. And I really appreciated that, because I just wish more people had that outlook, because things are complicated. And if you're not an expert, you probably don't know what you're talking about, right? Unfortunately, when people like Hitler, they come and they try to, they are not interested in the truth. They are interested in framing things in a way that is easy to mass market, to sell to people, to get people to understand, and then to manipulate those people. It's really sneaky the way he does it, because a lot of people read this book. I mean, it was eventually required reading in Nazi Germany, right? I think it was like every married couple received a copy of Mein Kampf, right? I mean, how crazy is that? But what's even more shocking is this stuff that's actually in here. Because when you start talking about people as a disease, man, it's no wonder that things got as bad as they did. It's no wonder. They're not people, they are a disease. Crazy. And again, I know I've said this a couple times throughout the series. Hitler may have been crazy evil, one of the worst people ever, but he was a brilliant propagandist. But I do think I'm going to end the episode there, kind of end on a serious note here. Yeah, it's just crazy stuff, guys. It's crazy stuff. Thank God we're not living through this, right? Thank God. But that's going to be it for the episode. I really hope you guys are enjoying the series so far. Hopefully we can finish this up soon. It's coming along great. Finally on page 185, right? So we got, a solid 5 pages down in this episode. It's progress. It's progress. Believe it or not, there's actually a lot of stuff I skip over in this series, which you may not believe, but I actually do. There's quite a bit of stuff I just have not talked about, because if I did, I would still be on page 50. So I'm doing my best here, guys. I hope you guys are enjoying the series. I hope you guys are getting a better understanding of Mein Kampf, right? I don't know if you guys are just really interested in history, or, you're just curious, right? That's how I started out. Just being really curious about these different topics. And, well, it's like, what did they actually say? And, what did these guys actually think? How did Hitler frame a problem? Right? Because these are just things that, the school isn't going to teach you, and there's not a whole lot of media about it. There's a lot of stuff calling Hitler evil, but there's not a lot of stuff that actually looks at what he says. And I think that's to our own detriment. So I'm glad you guys feel the same way that I do about it. Thank you so much for watching all the way through. This has been History for Thinkers. I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.
Thank you.